Some killers thought prison would be the end of their story. But for these predators, it was only the beginning. One would be stabbed more than 100 times behind bars. Another was killed with gym equipment inside a prison facility. And one inmate would lose his life during a prison attack that many still remember today. Disclaimer: this video is created for documentary and educational purposes, and some details may be disturbing. Viewer discretion is advised. Welcome to Murk Files. José Antonio Rodríguez Vega, born in 1957 in Santander, Spain, would later be known as El Mataviejas, the old lady killer. Outwardly, he appeared ordinary, a hard-working bricklayer, a husband, and a man who seemed reliable to those around him. Yet beneath this calm exterior lay a darkness that few could have imagined, born from years of personal trauma, familial violence, and deep-seated resentment. How does someone so ordinary transform into a predator capable of instilling fear into an entire community? Rodríguez Vega's early life was marked by dysfunction. Raised in a turbulent household, he witnessed and experienced acts of violence that shaped his worldview. By the time he was a teenager, his behavior had become aggressive and unpredictable. Arrested for multiple violent offenses at a young age, he served time in prison, where his manipulative charm allowed him to exploit the system, even securing early release. Could his crimes have been prevented if authorities had recognized the warning signs earlier? Or was this a man destined to spiral into darkness no matter what precautions were taken? Upon his release in 1986, Rodríguez Vega faced personal setbacks that would fuel his obsession and anger. Rejected by his first wife and still harboring resentment toward his mother, he began to focus on a particular type of victim: elderly women living alone. Over the course of roughly a year, he committed at least 16 murders, entering homes under the pretense of doing work, gaining trust, and then striking with chilling precision. Each crime was methodical, and he took care to conceal his actions, leaving many victims' deaths initially attributed to natural causes. Rodríguez Vega's meticulous nature extended beyond the act itself. He collected personal items from his victims, creating a red room in his home filled with trophies, a disturbing testament to his sense of control. When authorities broadcast images of this room, families identified objects linking him to their lost loved ones. The realization of his spree shocked the nation and left many wondering, how could a person so ordinary hide such calculated violence? And what drives someone to keep mementos from their victims? A constant reminder of lives destroyed. His trial in 1991 revealed the full extent of his crimes. Diagnosed as a psychopath, he was cold, calculating, and aware of his wrongdoing, yet devoid of remorse. Psychiatrists noted his ability to manipulate both victims and authorities, and his sentence, 440 years in prison, symbolized the magnitude of his crimes, even though Spanish law limited the time he could actually serve. While some might assume prison would contain him, the opposite proved true. In October 2002, after being transferred to a high-security prison module, Rodríguez Vega's notoriety followed him. Seen as unrepentant and manipulative, he became a target among inmates. Within days, 2 prisoners attacked him in the common area, fatally stabbing him 113 times, while guards reportedly watched without intervention. He died at the age of 44, buried quietly with minimal attendance. What does it say about justice when a predator is killed by fellow prisoners rather than through official channels? Does his violent end offer closure, or does it simply add another layer to the horror? And if someone so calculating and ordinary can live among society undetected, how many other predators might still walk freely today? As we close the chapter on José Antonio Rodríguez Vega, the unsettling truth remains. Appearances can deceive, and evil can hide behind the most ordinary faces. But not all predators meet the same fate. Some, like the next man we will meet, use charm and charisma to mask a deadly nature that terrified an entire community. A predator whose story would also end violently inside prison walls. This is the story of Charles Schmid. Charles Howard Schmid Jr., born in 1942, would become infamous as the Pied Piper of Tucson. On the surface, he was charismatic, handsome, and intelligent, a young man who seemed to have everything going for him. But behind his charm lay a darkness that would shock an entire community. How can someone who appears so ordinary inspire both admiration and fear? Schmid was adopted by a couple who ran a nursing home in Tucson, Arizona. His early life was marked by tension with his adoptive father and rejection from his birth mother, shaping a complex personality filled with resentment and need for control. In school, he excelled athletically, particularly in gymnastics, yet his behavior was erratic. A suspension for theft cut short his education, leaving him with a sense of freedom, resources, and autonomy at an age when most teens were still under supervision. Could this combination of charm, privilege, and lack of oversight have been the perfect storm that enabled his crimes? By the early 1960s, Schmid had become a magnetic presence in Tucson's teenage social scene. His nickname, Pied Piper, reflected the way he drew young people into his orbit, many of whom would later become unwilling accomplices or witnesses to his violent tendencies. Schmid manipulated appearances, padding his cowboy boots to seem taller, using makeup, even creating a faux mole on his face, all to craft an identity that would conceal the sinister reality beneath. The question remains, how many predators hide behind crafted personas, convincing society that they are harmless? Schmid's first known murder of high school student Aline Rowe in 1964 demonstrated a chilling combination of manipulation and violence. He involved friends in luring her under false pretenses, and the crime unfolded with calculated control. Months later, Schmid targeted Gretchen Fritz, a wealthy teenager, and her 13-year-old sister, Wendy. Using charm, deceit, and coercion, he ensnared them before ultimately taking their lives. His ability to exploit social trust and manipulate others raises a haunting question. How often do we mistake charisma for safety? And what signs are we blind to until it's too late? In 1966, the media descended on Tucson, documenting Schmid's crimes in publications such as Life magazine. The attention exposed the chilling reality of a predator hiding in plain sight, while legal authorities sought to ensure justice. Schmid was sentenced to death, though nationwide shifts in capital punishment law later commuted his sentence to 50 years. Even in prison, his story did not end quietly. Multiple escape attempts culminated in a successful breakout in 1972, where he briefly held hostages before being recaptured. A reminder that even behind bars, some predators can find ways to assert control and continue their terror. Ultimately, Charles Schmid met a violent end. In 1975, two fellow inmates fatally stabbed him 47 times. He succumbed to his injuries days later, and his body became a point of further chaos when it was stolen from the morgue, only to be recovered. Buried in the prison cemetery by his mother's request, Schmid's final resting place was deliberately secluded to avoid desecration. What does it mean when the predator himself falls victim to violence? Does it serve justice or simply perpetuate the cycle of brutality? And if someone so outwardly likable could conceal such horror, how many Pied Pipers might still walk among us today? Schmid's story reminds us that evil can hide behind charm, and that the most ordinary faces can mask the most extraordinary darkness. As we leave the unsettling tale of Charles Schmid, one chilling truth remains: even predators who charm and manipulate those around them are not untouchable. But what happens when a different kind of killer, one who terrorized not just strangers but his entire criminal network, finds himself trapped behind bars? Next, we confront Carl Williams, a man whose life of calculated violence would also meet a brutal, bloody end in prison. Carl Anthony Williams, a name etched in fear and infamy across Melbourne's criminal underworld. Born on October 13, 1970, Williams grew up in the shadow of Western Melbourne, the youngest of two boys. Life seemed ordinary at first. School, friends, a close bond with his older brother Shane, who would later succumb to a heroin overdose in 1997. But beneath the surface, a calculating and ruthless ambition was taking root. Williams's early ventures were far from glamorous. Jobs in labor and small business ventures, like a children's clothing store he co-owned with his wife Roberta Mercieca, came and went. Yet these failures masked a growing appetite for power and control, a hunger that would soon draw him into the deadly world of Melbourne's gangland wars. It began with a personal attack. On October 13, 1999, Jason Moran shot Williams in the abdomen over an $80,000 debt. What followed was a chain reaction of violence, a war fought not on distant battlefields, but in the streets, car parks, and homes of Melbourne. Williams responded by orchestrating a series of contract killings, enlisting hitmen, and paying large sums for murder. He would order the death of rivals, including the notorious Moran family, and even those who had once been allies. Perhaps the most chilling part: Williams didn't shy away from audacity. In June 2003, Moran and his associate Pasquale Barbaro were gunned down in front of children attending a football clinic. The gunman, later identified as Victor Brincat, revealed that Williams had paid him for the hits. The casual, cold calculation of orchestrating murders while the innocent watched, children under 7 in the back seat, raises a terrifying question. What drives a man to see murder as merely another transaction? Williams's reach extended far beyond simple street vendettas. Michael Marshall, Mark Mallia, Louis Moran, names that became synonymous with fear, all fell victim to his designs. And yet, even as the web of killings spread, law enforcement struggled to pin him down. It was only in 2007 that Williams would plead guilty to multiple murders, sealing his fate with a life sentence. Behind bars, Williams's life was far from ordinary. He became an informant, striking deals with police that included payments for his daughter Dakota's private schooling, an arrangement that would later spark speculation and controversy. Even in captivity, the world seemed to bend to his will, until April 19, 2010, when he was bludgeoned to death with the stem of an exercise bike by fellow inmate Matthew Charles Johnson. His life ended violently, fittingly, in the very confines meant to contain his chaos. Williams's story leaves us questioning the nature of criminal power, loyalty, and betrayal. How does a man move from failed businesses to commanding a network of killers? What drives someone to orchestrate death with such cold precision, knowing the innocence of those around them? And as we consider the consequences of his actions, the ripple effects on families, law enforcement, and even his own children, we are reminded that true crime is never simple, never distant. But as we close the chapter on Carl Williams, the shadows of violence do not dissipate. Across continents and decades, another predator waits in the wings, equally calculated and equally terrifying. One whose story would shake communities and challenge everything we think we know about predatory behavior. His name, Leroy Martin. If you're enjoying the video so far, subscribe, comment, and share. We're aiming to reach 1,000 subs by the end of March. Your support helps us keep these stories alive. Now back to the chilling case of Leroy Martin. Leroy Martin, a man whose charm masked a darkness so deep it terrorized an entire town. Born April 25, 1937, in South Carolina, Martin seemed ordinary. A textile mill worker, a part-time taxi driver, a devoted husband, and father of 3. On the surface, he was a man with responsibilities, routines, a family counting on him. But beneath that facade was a predator whose violence would leave 4 lives brutally stolen in less than a year. It began on March 1, 1967, with Annie Lucille Dedmond. After a night of drinking, she wandered off, leaving her husband Roger behind. Hours later, she was found dead on a highway. Police arrested Roger, convinced of his guilt. Sentenced to 18 years, his pleas of innocence fell on deaf ears. The real killer, however, was already plotting his next move. 9 months later, Martin's reign of terror escalated. On February 8, 1968, he abducted and murdered 2 victims in a single day, 20-year-old Nancy Carol Paris and 14-year-old Nancy Christine Reinhardt. He left Paris's body by a riverbank and buried Reinhardt beneath a brush pile, her foot protruding from the soil, a haunting visual of innocence destroyed. In a chilling act of control, he anonymously phoned Bill Gibbons, editor of the Gaffney Ledger, giving precise directions to the bodies and insisting that Roger Dedmond was innocent. 4 days later, he would strike again. On February 13, 1968, 15-year-old Opal Diane Buxton walked toward her school bus, unaware she was about to encounter Martin's shadow. He abducted her, throwing her into the trunk of his car while her sister watched in horror. Police traced tire tracks, recovered her body days later, strangled and stabbed, the final victim in Martin's deadly spree. The investigation revealed Martin's double life. He claimed to hear voices, insisting that a darker side of himself took control. A split personality with lethal consequences. Convicted of all 4 murders, he received 4 life sentences. But even in prison, the story didn't end. On May 31, 1972, Martin was stabbed to death by a fellow inmate, Kenneth Rumsey, a violent echo of the terror he once inflicted on the outside world. Leroy Martin's killings left scars that extended far beyond his victims. Entire communities were gripped by fear, locking doors, packing guns, and watching shadows with suspicion. The pain, anger, and disbelief lingered for decades, a grim reminder that evil can thrive behind the most ordinary of masks. Yet even as we close the chapter on Martin, another story of manipulation and murder lurks just beyond the headlines, one that would grip a small town, challenge notions of trust, and leave the question of innocence hanging in the balance once more. Jesse Michael Anderson, a man whose life of deceit would end in a violent twist of fate. Born May 3, 1957, in Alton, Illinois, Anderson seemed the picture of normalcy. A devoted father, a community volunteer, treasurer of the local Lions Club, and an active member of his church. But appearances can be deadly misleading. On April 21st, 1992, Anderson went out to dinner and a movie with his wife Barbara in suburban Milwaukee. What should have been an ordinary evening erupted into horror. Anderson stabbed Barbara 5 times in the face and head before turning the knife on himself. Claiming they had been attacked by 2 black men, he tried to divert suspicion, presenting police with a prop, a Los Angeles Clippers cap, supposedly knocked from one of the assailants' heads. But police investigation unraveled his story. The hat had been purchased days before, and the murder weapon was traced back to him. Within weeks, Anderson was convicted of murdering his wife and sentenced to life in prison. Yet, Anderson's story did not end in the courtroom. On November 28, 1994, behind the walls of the Columbia Correctional Institution in Wisconsin, fate took a darkly ironic turn. Assigned to a prison work detail with fellow inmates, Anderson found himself alongside none other than Jeffrey Dahmer, the infamous serial killer. A confrontation with their cellmate, Christopher Scarver, ended violently. Scarver struck Dahmer with a steel bar, then pursued Anderson, leaving him critically injured. Anderson lingered for 2 days before dying in the hospital, life extinguished as abruptly as it had been taken from his wife. Even in prison, the consequences of Anderson's choices rippled outward. His attempts to manipulate the truth, to shift blame and evade responsibility ultimately offered no protection from the violence that surrounded him. In the end, justice, of a sort, came not from the courts, but from the brutal logic of the penitentiary itself, where predators collide and survival often favors neither cunning nor cruelty. And yet, for every chapter closed, another begins. As the walls of Wisconsin contained Anderson and Dahmer, the shadows of the American criminal underworld stretched southward toward a man whose crimes would test the limits of depravity and make Leroy Martin and Jesse Anderson seem almost restrained, the notorious Donald Gaskins. Donald Henry Pee Wee Gaskins Jr. was born on March 13, 1933, in Florence County, South Carolina, the last of a string of children born out of wedlock. His early years were defined by neglect, abuse, and an almost complete absence of guidance. Nicknamed Pee Wee for his small stature, Gaskins endured a childhood that included accidental poisoning, violent encounters, and sexual abuse at reform school. These formative experiences honed a mind that would become cunning, manipulative, and disturbingly charming, a mask for the monstrous acts to come. As a young adult, Gaskins plunged into a life of crime. Burglaries, assaults, and sexual offenses marked the beginning of a trajectory that would escalate into murder. By the late 1960s, he had begun killing those who crossed him, or who he simply chose as targets, often picking up hitchhikers along the highways of the American South. He classified his victims as coastal kills, claiming he hunted people for pleasure, torturing and killing them in ways he detailed in his memoirs. Gaskins's confirmed murders included teenagers, young adults, and even children, often people close to him or those who posed any perceived threat to his criminal schemes. By 1975, Gaskins's violent spree reached a crescendo. In a single year, he murdered multiple individuals, including Dennis Bellamy and John Henry Knight, executed with chilling precision. His crimes were not random. They were calculated acts designed to protect his criminal interests, silence potential informants, or simply satisfy his own twisted impulses. Yet, despite his growing notoriety, law enforcement finally caught up with him, uncovering shallow graves near his home and connecting him to a string of disappearances and murders that had haunted the region for years. Even behind bars, Gaskins' reign of terror did not end. In 1982, while imprisoned at Central Correctional Institution, he murdered fellow death row inmate Rudolf Tyner using a C4 explosive rigged in a speaker. The act earned him the grim title of the meanest man in America and underscored the cold ingenuity and ruthlessness that defined his life. Convicted and sentenced to death for this final act, Gaskins' infamy was cemented, and his claim of having killed over 100 people, though largely disputed, haunted the annals of American crime history. On September 6, 1991, Gaskins met the electric chair, his final words stark and unrepentant. "I'll let my lawyers talk for me. I'm ready to go." His life, a tapestry of manipulation, murder, and brutality, ended as violently as it had been lived. Gaskins stands as a chilling reminder of how early trauma, cunning intellect, and unchecked violence can collide to create one of the most feared predators in modern American history, leaving behind a trail of sorrow, terror, and unanswered questions. As the shadows of these men's crimes fade, their stories linger, haunting reminders of how darkness can hide behind charm, manipulation, and a seemingly ordinary life. Hit subscribe and join the Murk Files community to stay updated on the world's most chilling true crime cases. Share your thoughts below. Who do you think was the most terrifying predator, and why? And don't leave yet. Turn on notifications so you never miss the next episode, where we shine a light on the stories the world tries to forget. Stay curious, stay safe,